Hi, everyone. I have the honor to introduce to you once again, the one and only Dr. Eric Helms. Doc, welcome back to the channel.
It's an honor to be back on. Thank you so much for having me, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. It is truly an honor to be chatting with you. Last time you enlightened us with your knowledge was back in 2019 in Singapore.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's been a while.
Absolutely.
Yeah, back then I had the pleasure to learn from you in person, which was a little bit different than now, but I'm sure this experience will be just as great.
Well, let's hope so. It's the best we can do with the current world situation.
Exactly. Yeah, guys, by the way, Dr. Eric Helms has some awesome books called the Muscle and Strength Pyramid. They have been recently translated to traditional Chinese. Shout out to Rachel for that. I can only imagine how hard that would have been.
Yeah, and Rachel's an absolute star for doing that.
And yeah, like I was saying, they are exceptional. They break down the science of hypertrophy, strength, and nutrition in a very detailed and unbiased way. However, keeping concepts simple and very easy to digest. So yeah, guys, I will leave the link for those for the books in the description of the video, so you can check them out. Doc, would you like to introduce the books a little bit further?
Yeah, absolutely. No, just thank you so much for taking time to intro them. And generally, I think most people make the mistake of buying into the clickbait that they see online that makes everything seem incredibly important all at the same time. You have to get your supplementation right. You have to eat at the right times. You have to eat enough protein. You have to do this amount of volume. You have to use these exercises. And because of the way online marketing is, where something has to be the most important thing that you're missing right now, it leaves you with a lot of potentially correct information, but with no ability to prioritize it and to know where to put your efforts. So the whole reason they're called the pyramids is because they help create like a priority list. So you know what to focus on first, what things you need to learn, so you're not just overwhelmed by information. So I think everything you did a great job introducing them. That's the only thing I would add, just that they help you take a evidence-based look at what is not only the correct information, but what's the best way to prioritize it so you can put it into a system to actually see continual progress.
Yeah, I think they're great because they teach you the principles in order of importance as well. So then we can go ahead and make our own plans, our own training plan, our own nutritional plan without the help of a coach or anything like that. So yeah, I have gone through the nutrition book and I'm halfway through the training book. So awesome. Yeah, they're amazing. Seriously, I'm not joking. They have helped me so much. So I recommend it to everyone out there. Again, you guys can find the links for those books in the description of the video. So Doc, are you ready to get into the questions?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
I have a bunch of them from my followers on Instagram, subscribers on YouTube, and myself as well. So if you don't mind me asking, I'll get right into it.
And that'll be my pleasure.
Nice. Question number one, spot reduction. Is it actually possible? Because a while ago, I read an article you did for Mass Research that you review a research paper on localized fat loss, where it was actually shown that spot reduction could be possible. So will you be able to let us know your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this was one of those studies that it just caught fire online when it came out, because all of the data leading up to this point suggested that we couldn't really choose where fat got liberated from. And since everyone would love to be able to spot reduce, and it's something that is definitely, it seems intuitive. Like if I do a lot of work for a general area, I can make it look better, and something bodybuilders have talked about since the pumping iron days. Do a lot of crunches and lean up your midsection type of thing. It's one of those things that caught fire because it seemed contrary to the data we had. So there was a study that came out that I reviewed in Mass that suggested that there was some localized fat loss using a specific protocol to where you could preferentially lose fat in a specific area. However, when I wrote that review, I said, look, here's what was found, but a couple of things needed to be pointed out. First, it's the only study showing that. All the other data goes the other direction. It's also a small sample size. And I think I didn't write about this, but James Krieger did a great job as another research reviewer and a researcher. He pointed out that the the amount of fat that was lost and what could be expected when you look at some of the mechanistic data, like how much actual grams of fat are processed, it's so small that it shouldn't make any difference. So it's probably a combination of sampling variance, just some of the random noise in studies, while also seeing these very, very small, but likely non-realistically beneficial, like kind of just negligible changes going on in the actual outcomes. So ultimately, like if you do improve blood flow to an area, it is easier for your body to liberate stores from there. However, in the long run, that's such a small difference. And you also go through this process of storing fat, burning fat, storing fat, burning fat all day long. We go from fed to fasted, that it's unclear whether or not you would just kind of go back to your natural fat deposition patterns anyway. So I would say from any kind of practical standpoint, spot reduction is not possible. Is it technically, physiologically possible to a very small degree that you'd never notice? Yes, but it's probably not relevant.
But do you think it's worth a try for competitors that are trying to get like super lean for that stage condition? Do you think it's worth it?
It's certainly... You know, the thing is, I've been trying this stuff for like a decade, and I've never really seen some of the stubborn fat protocol methods that was essentially what was more or less used in this study. Even when you combine it with things that should help, like yohimbine and stuff like that, I've never seen it make any kind of difference that I could tell the difference in. So ultimately, for a competitor, if they have an area of their body that is not quite lean enough, they simply need to keep dieting. And ensure they're not losing muscle mass. The best thing you can do to increase the efficiency of fat loss is maintain muscle mass. Because if you can do a good job of maintaining muscle mass and just carry on in the deficit, then eventually everything will get lean. And that's one thing, like everyone has stubborn body fat for competitors 6 weeks out, but no one seems to have it, once they're on stage. So
that's true. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to the second question, weightlifting belts. Who should be wearing them? And is it suitable for beginners?
Yeah, I would say that there's nothing wrong with them. I think the concern, and why this is often asked, is that if you wear a weightlifting belt, you won't learn how to brace without it. But that's actually the opposite of the way they work. So weightlifting belts tend to increase abdominal pressure and enhance performance. There is actually studies showing you can produce more force and lift heavier weights wearing them because you're bracing against them. If you weren't bracing, they wouldn't work. So they're essentially like an external transverse abdominis, so which is a muscle that's basically kind of like a strap around your midsection. You brace against that. When you take an air and do a Valsalva maneuver, which is just holding your breath while you lift, which is a natural thing that everyone does most of the time, it creates a more stable core so that you can transfer force from your legs or your body through your whole system. So when you wear a belt, it just gives you more to brace against. I think there are misconceptions about what belts do. Some people think that they're protecting your back or something like that, and they're not really. They are in so much as they make you more stable. But the thing is as you get that increased stability, you can lift heavier loads. So, for example, we did a study on low bar versus high bar squats in our lab with like 3D cameras on people and looked at the difference in biomechanics. And we couldn't have them wearing a belt because it was getting in the way of the EMG electrodes and the the markers on their joints so that the 3D cameras could see it. And these were all Olympic weightlifters and powerlifters, so they knew what they could squat with a belt. And on average, they were squatting about 10% less beltless. So I think that's a pretty common occurrence. It's not true for everyone. Some people are fine without a belt, but the average power lifter or average Olympic lifter or just seasoned lifter, if you ask them what do they squat with and without a belt, the number will typically be a little bit higher with a belt. So, and that's because it increases that force transference. Now, it does change the muscle pattern recruitment slightly. You tend to see less oblique activation when you're not wearing a belt, which if you think about it, if you've got like a 10 millimeter belt that's fat you just won't be able to rock side to side as much to need that stabilization. So that's why you see primarily just the rectus abdominis activate into a greater degree with a belt versus beltless. So generally what I would recommend is when you're going for heavy loads, and if your goal is to just lift heavier weights, feel free to wear a belt. If your goal is purely hypertrophy, you probably don't really need it, because it's not about lifting heavier loads, it's about getting stronger over time if your goal is to get bigger. So, if anything you can do that'll put 10 kilos on your squat 5 minutes later isn't going to really help with hypertrophy, but it is something that you probably want to do if your goal is to increase absolute 1RM, like for a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter. Last thing I would say is that there is some skill, and this goes back to the question being about beginners, with wearing a belt. It feels a little bit different, especially to wear a heavy-duty powerlifting belt. So for those who lift beltless, be aware that you can't just decide, you know what, I'm just going to wear my belt for my first powerlifting meet. You probably want to train for a month or so wearing it, because it does feel a little different when you expand and you get an air. You have to figure out exactly how tight and how loose the belt should be for different lifts. Being at the bottom of a conventional deadlift versus a sumo deadlift versus the bottom of a squat versus the top all feels a little different, and it's going to be individual. So it is something that is a slightly different skill, not totally different by any means, but something that should be practiced.
So the thought that wearing the belt will weaken your core is not really something anymore.
No.
Okay, so people shouldn't worry about that.
No.
Do you think beginners in any way will be missing out on something if they start wearing belts from the very, very beginning, from the first day that they step into the gym?
I think, if there's some concern about it does change motor activation, maybe you don't need to, stabilize as much. I think it's probably just a better idea to remember that, well, look, you only need to put it on once you're going relatively heavy. So, and only movements where you care about absolute load. So let's say you've got somebody who is working up to a 140 kilo squat. They probably don't need to put it on until their last warm up at, let's say, 120, right? But when they do their warm up sets at 100, 80, 60 in the bar, don't wear the belt. That's totally fine. And then you're probably getting enough of a stimulus to get those stabilizers. And then when you do your, let's say, dumbbell split squats later or lunges, then don't need to wear the belt, because those are there to assist the main lift. No one really cares how much you're split squatting. That's just there to build your quads and act as an assistance movement. So even if you were to start wearing a belt from the very beginning of your lifting career, so long as you just use it when necessary and you understand its purpose, you probably wouldn't be missing out on anything, unless you had a really narrow exercise selection, which I wouldn't recommend.
Awesome. All right, next question. How should we approach training from home if the goal is to build or at least maintain muscle mass and strength?
Yeah, that's a good question. So maintaining muscle mass is relatively easy for anyone who's on lockdown or quarantine. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but there's an easy answer. It doesn't feel easy by any means. And that is, guess what? Higher reps work almost just as effectively as lower reps. The problem is that it's very difficult to push yourself to go to a high RPE or close proximity to failure when you're doing 30 or 40 reps. So essentially, you just have to get creative and find ways to train each muscle group at home. Some things will be easy for people to figure out. We just talked about split squats. You can do those with bands, standing on it, holding on to it to increase resistance. You can do those with a backpack filled with books. If you have the luxury of having some home gym equipment, you can do it with kettlebells or dumbbells. But split squats can be a great exercise for the glutes and great exercise for the quads. If you want to train your hamstrings, you got to get a little more creative. You can do Nordic hamstring curls, which is basically lowering yourself under control. You can tuck your feet under, say, the couch or the edge of a bed, or have a friend or a partner hold your ankles, and you just do the eccentric. You can train your hamstrings. Calves, single leg body weight calf raises with a nice pause at the bottom, and you've got pretty much your lower body training down. After that, we all are familiar with push-ups, and there are various variations. You can get your chest pretty effectively. If you're strong, you can do handstand push-ups for shoulders. If you're not quite as strong, you can do like pike push-ups, which is basically kind of like in a downward dog position from yoga. And as far as your back training, if you have one of those pull-up bars at home, don't use your door. You can pull that sucker down pretty easily unless it's a really, really sturdy door. But you can do rows on the table with your feet underneath. So you can do like body weight rows. So long as you have enough creativity, you can find a way to maintain a bodybuilding program. It will get pretty boring. You will have to be pushing close to failure. Some things that can help is a set of bands, blood flow restriction cuffs. Those are great because then you hit fatigue earlier, so you don't have to do 40 reps. You might only have to do 20 or 15. As far as strength, though, that is more challenging. The primary variable that influences strength is the absolute load on the bar or in your hands or however you care about it. So I would say if your goal is strength, you may be challenged in training at home unless you do have home gym equipment. You can do some things to do low rep training. Like, for example, when I was stuck at home training, when we had our lockdown here in New Zealand, I was working on my handstand push-ups, and I could only do, I think, 4 the first time I tried that. And I eventually got up to doing 10. So that's pretty low rep training, and that was a strength goal for me. But, you know, pistol squats is another very hard one, you know, that you can work on your pistol squat strength, but you'd be hard pressed to find movements that are sufficiently challenging that you can also load that are purely body weight. So that's a tougher one. But do remember that if you maintain or even gain muscle mass, that's going to eventually translate to long-term strength development. So when you come back to training and you start building up slowly, which you should definitely do slowly and gradually, you hopefully will be able to have a higher ceiling.
How long do you think we could maintain this kind of training because of the uncertainty right now that we don't know when this thing's going to end, this virus thing is going to end? So how long do you think we can train at home for without being detrimental eventually for our muscle?
Yeah, I would say if you were to look at people who do calisthenics training, they would say for your whole life, you know, because ultimately if you build those skills and you train differently and you focus on those various variations and you start working on things like a plange, you know, you can, if instead of you thinking of it as this is this crappy training that I have to do instead of going to the gym. If you think of, you know what, I'm going to fully commit to learning how to do this body weight thing, there's a whole other, you know, pocket of the fitness industry that talks about body weight training and calisthenics, and they do some incredible stuff, and they've got some incredible, at least upper bodies, you know. So I think, you know, if you think about gymnasts, calisthenics folks, you could make that a training modality and develop quite an impressive physique. You might start to lose some leg mass, or I think there's some muscle groups that are very difficult to train just purely body weight at home, like your lumbar extensors. But if you are in a situation where you're stuck at home for a long period of time, if you're serious about your training, I imagine you'd also start thinking about, okay, what equipment can I get, you know? And some things that I'd recommend for people that are both affordable and provide you a lot of options would be things like a weighted vest, adjustable dumbbells. Those are also great. You know, you can do like floor presses, dumbbell rows. If you get yourself some adjustable dumbbells, that can really sustain you long term. So I know a lot of people who have previously had a gym membership, bought some equipment, and now they're just taking the money they would have spent on their gym membership and just, you know, kitting out their home gym more and more and more.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. Next question is, how does alcohol affect muscle growth?
Good question. Yeah, in reasonable doses, it doesn't affect it much to the point where you'd want to worry about it. But, you know, alcohol is a toxin, effectively. And it does seem to have a negative impact on muscle protein synthesis, especially acutely in large doses. So I wouldn't advise like getting hammered post-workout. But if you're someone who enjoys your nightlife, that's not too big of a deal. I think you could, first off, let me just say that I don't recommend anyone to do binge drinking. You know, I think that's just, even if you didn't lift weights, that's not healthy, and it has long-term negative mental and physical health consequences. So, but going out and getting, you know, buzzed or having a fun weekend occasionally, I think is probably something that can coexist with lifting without an issue. I mean, there's enough frat boys out there to kind of show anecdotally, at least that seems to be the case. So there's that. But I would say that like serious, regular social drinking where you do regularly get drunk probably is having a negative impact on your gains. It won't completely stop you. And some of the largest negative effects will be the acute effects on performance. So for example, like if you decide to go out on a Sunday night and get blitzed and you have a Monday morning training session, that's probably not going to go well, you know? So I'd say most of it is logistical. You have to think about where will I need to be recovering and where will I need to be fresh, not hungover. And that, you know, that can make up for a lot of it. And then if you are someone who is regularly drinking and getting drunk, I think that's something just from an overall health perspective that you probably want to look at and think about.
And what if you drink regularly, but you don't get drunk all the time? Say if you have a glass of wine or a beer, but your overall diet is still spot on. Will you think?
And you're probably 100% fine. And I think so long as you actually consider the energy intake of alcoholic drinks, like I think a lot of people, because they only know how to like track macros, they look at, and most alcohol, not all, but many alcohol doesn't like show the calorie content. You know, so what I often do when I recommend people, if they are tracking their nutrition and they're not sure what to do or how to incorporate alcohol, they can just shift to protein and calories instead of tracking all macros. So it's like, oh, I'll hit my protein target and then I'll have my total calorie intake. And then now I can just look up what is the rough, you know, calorie intake of, I don't know, a glass of wine or Red Bull and vodka or whatever they end up having. And then they can incorporate that into their overall diet. And I think so long as, like you said, they're not drinking to the point of getting drunk, regular glass of wine here and there, beer is probably totally fine. Totally fine.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. How and when is muscle actually built? For example, is it built during the training session, right after, or during our sleep?
Great question. So we were talking earlier about muscle protein synthesis, and muscle protein balance is the outcome of muscle protein synthesis minus muscle protein breakdown. And that's a very kind of crude way of describing how we gain or lose lean body mass. So when we're in a net negative muscle protein balance or a net positive muscle protein balance, that means we're either losing or gaining total lean body mass respectively. So if you were to not lift weights at all, but eat a high protein diet, you would see these post-meal spikes in muscle protein synthesis and then they'd fall, but you'd still stay roughly the same size. And that's because not very much of that muscle protein synthesis would elevate the net muscle protein balance. Now, however, when you lift weights, what it does is it creates this sensitization to where you can reach higher peak and longer sustained levels of elevated muscle protein synthesis when you eat protein after that. So essentially what it does is, and there's data showing this lasts anywhere from say 16 to 48 hours, a single resistance training session will elevate your capacity for higher muscle protein synthesis in the trained muscles for that long, depending on what your training age is. And it's impacted by other factors like calorie intake as well. Or if you have too low of a calorie intake, it does lower muscle protein synthesis. So if you have sufficient energy, and if you have sufficient protein intake, and then if you're also resistance training, it creates this window of opportunity, which is actually, like I said, sometimes 2 days long. So if you're training 4 days a week, you're essentially always in this state where the trained muscles are ready to have an elevated muscle protein synthesis more than if you were not training, which should result in overall net positive muscle protein balance and therefore accrual of muscle proteins in the trained muscles and therefore gaining lean body mass. So the answer is, if you're lifting weights, it's essentially happening all the time. And it is a continual process because if you trained last week, and let's just say right now, we'll just look at me. I haven't taken more than a week off of training in 16 years. So I'm currently growing muscle right now because I had my lunch not too long ago and it had protein in it. And, you know, depending on how much I lose after that and how much I gain next week and this week, I may or may not gain muscle. Hopefully there's some there, but, you know, I'm getting pretty close to the slow days, I should say, of my career as a lifter in terms of the rates of muscle gain that are accruing. So yeah, it's basically always happening for someone who's regularly lifting. I guess technically it's happening anytime there are circulating amino acids and you've recently lifted, is a way to say it.
Okay, awesome. Will you be able to explain to us what BFR is and whether it works or not?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I said it earlier, and if someone were like, what are you talking about? So BFR stands for blood flow restriction training. And the idea is that you would place a cuff over a limb, and that would be tight so that it would restrict blood flow to some degree. So what this does is it increases the like you've ever had a blood pressure cuff on, you can feel it's real tight, and you can see your kind of arms swell up. What's happening there is that you're partially restricting blood flow such that blood can readily get into the muscle, but it's having trouble getting out, so it pools. And that pooling means that if you were to train while doing that, the metabolites that come from fatigue of doing reps and getting closer and closer to failure aren't cleared as effectively. So failure starts to happen earlier. So what happens is you get fast twitch motor unit recruitment, so that all the fibers that would normally only be trained if you had to do more reps to go to failure, or if you lifted substantially heavier, will happen earlier. So you can take, for example, 20 to 40% of 1RM, and you can do multiple sets short of failure. They'll still be in a very high fatigue spot because of the blood flow restriction, and you'll end up getting a similar effect to if you did traditional training. Now, as I talked about earlier, strength is largely related to load on the bar and peak intensity. So if you're only training with 20 to 40% of 1RM, that's not going to be as effective as, say, training with 60 to 100% of 1RM. And the data shows that while you can gain strength with BFR training in the 20 to 40% range, which is very light, that most of the time it would allow 40 reps or more, it's not as effective as traditional heavy training for strength, but for hypertrophy, it is, which is pretty cool. So BFR does work. However, it is limited to working for muscle groups that you can effectively restrict blood flow to. So it's very difficult to occlude the torso. You wouldn't want to put a blood flow restriction cuff around your neck. I would not recommend that. It ends up being a tool that you can use for the limbs. So the two sites of blood flow restriction would be basically at the armpit and then at the crease of the groin, so at the hip. And so you can get an effective stimulus for, say, quads, hamstrings, calves, biceps, triceps. You can get there has been observed hypertrophy in the pecs from doing BFR on chest presses. However, it's probably because you see the triceps failing first, and therefore the pecs have to do more work. It's kind of like pre-exhaust, if you will. So BFR does work. It's a great tool for athletes when they can't use higher loads or they wouldn't want to. So, for example, if they have tendinopathy, they have pain in their elbow from curling, or if they have a knee injury, or if they have a back injury where they can do squats but they're very limited by load, that type of thing.
So this is quite similar to actually going to failure. Am I getting that right? Yeah.
To some degree, yeah. So when you do reps, especially in a rhythmic fashion, where you're not necessarily doing the last little bit of range of motion on lockout, where there is what's called venous occlusion when you're doing reps. As you're getting the pump, what you're actually feeling is that effect, where you're getting more and more blood pooling in the muscle. It's not as effective, and you don't reach the same levels that you would with blood flow restriction training, but it is a similar effect. It is basically a more practical way of getting to failure earlier. Because if you were to take a non-blood flow restricted limb and do curls for 40 reps, you would be able to use a heavier load than if you used BFR. And you don't have to do 40 reps with BFR. You can do anywhere from, say, 15 to 30 for 3 sets, and you would probably get an effective stimulus. So it allows you to use even lighter loads, but have them still be effective. So you can just go light and do a lot of reps, but it is difficult to gauge where failure is when you're doing such high reps. And that's probably what would be needed to make very low load, high rep training as effective as BFR or heavy training. So the general protocol that's used in BFR is doing like a primer set of 30 to 40 and then doing 3 sets of 15. And it's rare that those other 3 sets to 15 are to failure, which means that it's pretty effective even when you're not quite at failure. So BFR is kind of a safer way to ensure that you're actually able to use the lightest load possible to give you that joint recovery and also get that stimulus for hypertrophy compared to light load training without BFR.
And are you currently implementing this to your training?
I do, yeah. So I use it semi-regularly whenever because I'm 38, so I'm old for as far as a lifter is concerned. So I sometimes get, I know, not really, but I'm old enough to where I start to get elbow pain, like if I do regular supinated curls a lot. Or, I occasionally will get a niggle, like I want to unload my lower back. So for example, after I peaked for my last powerlifting competition, I had a 3-week training cycle where I wanted just to take load off my back because I was feeling pretty beat up. So I was able to do like BFR tempo squats with 70 kilos and still get a good stimulus, even though I can squat, over 220 kilos. So being able to do like a third of that weight is felt fantastic on my back, and then allowed me to kind of recover and not lose any leg mass.
Yeah. You just mentioned tempo. I want to quickly ask you a question about this. Because tempo in your book is right at the top of the pyramid.
The least important, yes.
Yeah, so because I see a lot of people actually doing tempo training, and I would like to ask your thoughts about this. Is it something that people should apply to their training? Is it not? What are your thoughts on this?
Good question. Yeah, it's a very specific tool. So it's important to remember that the way we actually produce high levels of tension on muscle fibers is by trying to exert the highest force levels possible. And actually having a slowing of the movement due to either high load or approaching failure. So if you tried to lift a barbell with as much force as you could, it would just fly out of your hands if you didn't hold on to it, or you'd jump if it was on your back. And you won't be able to produce enough force because the load is too light. As you increase load on the bar, you can start producing very high levels of force immediately. If it's like 80% or 90% of your 1RM, that very first rep is going to require recruitment of nearly all the muscle fibers in the contributing muscles. And it's not going to move that fast because it's so heavy. It's just physics. So you're going to get relatively high force levels on a per fiber basis. You can get there as well if you were to load, say, 50% of 1RM and just keep doing reps. And eventually, that bar speed would slow down as fibers fatigued and other fibers had to pick up the slack. So you essentially get to the same place doing low load, high rep training to failure versus heavy load training. What doesn't get you there, though, is taking a light load and purposely lifting it slowly, right? Because you're only exerting enough force as to move that load at the speed that it's moving. So you can get around that by doing tempo, like moderate load training to failure. But the question is why? Why are you going so slow? And there can be reasons. The reasons might be that, higher speeds cause pain, or that you're trying to limit the absolute load so that you can, protect the joint. So for example, on those tempo squats, I was doing, say, a 3 or 4 second eccentric and a pause at the bottom, and then maximally accelerating it on the concentric. So that way I'm getting kind of the best of both worlds. I'm not slowing down the concentric and reducing that muscle tension and muscle force output. But on the eccentric, that's the lowering phase of a lift, you're much stronger anyway. So for example, most people are 20 to 40% stronger on the eccentric. And this is, you can just look at any powerlifting meet on when someone misses a squat, they miss it on the way up. They can lower it into the hole, they come up, they get stuck, and then they go down. You can load 10, 20, 30, 40 kilos more than your max and get into the hole, but you won't get out of it. To actually overcome your eccentric strength, you have to load so much that it looks like they just, that one classic YouTube video, the skinny guy in the Smith machine who loads like 700 pounds and then just gets crushed it just falls out of the camera. That's eccentric failure. That's when you can't even lower the weight under control. So you're basically always on the eccentric phase of the lowering phase of a lift. You're purposely lowering it under slower control than need be. And that's fine because that's not an active contraction. It's technically an eccentric action. That's you deliberately moving the load into a position where then you can do the concentric. So that's fine. And there's even data to suggest that a more controlled eccentric, not much more, but just a normal tempo, is better than just like letting gravity do the work for you. That's where you do start to see the downsides of not controlling your tempo whatsoever. So yeah, there is a time and place for tempo-based lifting, and it's probably when you want to reduce the load so that if you have joint pain, so that you can still get an effective stimulus. But to effectively get a good hypertrophy stimulus, you would still need to take it to the point of a high level of exertion, so getting close to failure at that tempo.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Would you recommend anyone to follow a German volume training?
The classic 10 by 10. I think I would say that that's not the way I recommend people think about training, thinking about specific programs. I think instead of seeing German volume training as like a thing and it's a system, and then I read these Reddit comments and they say it's good and this guy says it's bad, I'm confused. Is it good or bad? Programs aren't good or bad. We want to get away from thinking is 5s better than 3s. We want to think about what does 5s do? What does 10s do? How much volume is appropriate? How much volume is not enough? When should I do low volume? When should I do higher volumes? So German volume training, you could think of a time when 10 sets would be a good number of sets for a movement. And you could think of a time when 10 reps per set might not be a bad idea. If you're in a work capacity or hypertrophy phase, that wouldn't be what I would program, but it would still fit the bill, So that would be okay, but then I want to know, like, what are your goals? What are we going to do after that? If someone's just like, hey, I want to switch it up, I'm going to do GVT, then I go like, I don't know if that's a good idea. Like, well, how much volume are you doing? How close to failure you're going? What exercise are you going to use? I've actually seen people who reduce their volume going on GVT because they were training twice a week doing, say, 6 sets per muscle group, and then they go to once per week doing 10 sets. They think they're doing high volume, but that's just because the name of the program is volume training. But in reality, they went from 12 to 10 sets per week. So what do you expect is going to happen? You're now basically doing, 90% of the volume, but half of it's at a lower quality because you're so fatigued by the time you get there. It's not going to be better, So I think that's how I want people to start thinking is what's an appropriate amount of volume? What is the best exercise selection? What frequency makes sense for me? But generally doing 10 hard sets for the same exercise or muscle group in the same session, that's not a good idea in my opinion. I prefer to see like 6 to 8. Anyway, that's not true. Like 3 to 8 hard sets for a muscle group in a given exercise. And then if you want to go above that, it's worth thinking about increasing your frequency.
All right. This question is a little bit different. How do you know if your coach is a good coach?
Good question. So I think there are a couple qualities that you want to see in a coach. One is open-mindedness, meaning that they are open to new ideas. They want your feedback, so it's collaborative. And they are not just using a one-size-fits-all approach for all their athletes or clients. A second thing is they need to be good communicators and they need to care about you. So if you don't feel like they're listening to you, if you don't feel like they're considering your input, if you feel like you're pursuing their goals for you instead of them helping you pursue your goals, that's probably not a good sign. And you also want to be able to trust them. Like if you have doubts about your coach, that's not a good sign. There should be a relationship. And then finally, they should be, caring about their craft, staying up to date with the latest evidence and trying to do things in a way that make logical sense and investing time and effort into staying up to date with that. But I would say those first two qualities are far more important than the third. Like sometimes people think that a good coach is someone who uses evidence-based methods. There are plenty of bad coaches who use evidence-based methods. Coaching is about relationships. Coaching is about collaborating with another human being and about supporting people and helping them solve individualized problems for their specific situation. And, if good coaching was the same as evidence-based practice, that means that no coach from 20 years ago could have been a good coach because they were just, they didn't have the same scientific advancements that we did today. But we know that coaching is a skill set. It's an art. and you simply complement it with taking the best approach that we have based on the available data. So that would be my answer to that.
Nice. And the next one is being big and shredded good enough to give training advice?
No, that's a very easy one to answer. I'd say absolutely not. The biggest thing that's going to affect whether or not you're big and shredded is, well, it's a couple things. One, you probably have been training pretty hard. But two, you might have just picked the right parents. And if you pick the right parents and are also using anabolic steroids and are doing things okay but not great, and you've been doing that for 10 years, you're going to have a better physique than 99% of people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the best advices for other people. So the simple answer is no. There's a saying in English, success leaves clues. And it's basically saying like, hey, we should look to people who are successful and emulate what they do. And to some degree that's true, but it doesn't mean it's the best thing. It means it's sufficient. It is the minimum. All we know is that person is not doing anything that's preventing them from being successful. But something that doesn't prevent you from being successful isn't necessarily something that's causing you to be successful. So that's why it's important to look to other things than anecdote when you're looking for the best evidence available. We don't care about just good enough. We want to know what's good, better, and maybe ideally best, although it's almost impossible to answer that question. So people who are, I think, truly interested in taking the best approach for them need to think about, like, what's the best evidence I have, not sufficient evidence, which is essentially what's happening when you're just basing it on how good someone else looks. Yeah, it's a funny thing because this mindset only seems to exist in like the fitness and bodybuilding world, because like no one expects the best basketball or football or tennis coach in the world to also have to currently be the world champion, But I can't tell you how many times people would see, like back in the day, I was coaching Matt Ogus, like we're talking like 2013, and they see me talking to Matt Ogus and they're like, why are you bigger than your coach? And it's like, why is John Wooden like not as good of a basketball player as the rest of the UCLA basketball team? Like no one ever is like, I'm not listening to this guy because he's not Michael Jordan, While Michael Jordan didn't do a great job with the Wizards, So it's the idea that simply like Mr. Olympia is the best coach in the world and the best athlete is kind of a laughable proposition, but it is like the mindset that exists in bodybuilding, but it doesn't exist anywhere else in sport. So I've always found that pretty funny. So.
All right, Doc, next question. This person says, now that I'm training at home, I usually get interrupted by my kids a few times, which leads to having a disrupted training session. Sometimes I stop for 10 to 15 minutes before I can continue to work out. Will this affect my ability to grow muscle if I still complete my training session?
That's a good question. And that's a very like a COVID question. It's something we all have been struggling with. And I think even people who don't have kids, like for example, I train in my garage, and right there is our washer and dryer. So it's very easy to like do laundry between sets. And I think first off, let me just say that if you're completing all the sets and reps and the loads that you've intended, it's probably going to have a negligible effect on your overall outcomes, even if you end up having like 10, 15 minutes between a few sets. Just be aware if you are lifting heavy, which you probably can't even do at home, but let's say you do have a home gym. If you were like, let's say, doing sets of triples on squats and you took 15 minutes between two sets because you had to deal with your kids, you might want to do like a little bit of a warm-up first again, because you don't want to cool down and you don't want to come back to like, oh, it's been 15 minutes, let me jump under this 3-rep max. That's the only thing from a safety perspective I would say you should be concerned with. But the only real thing I do think that can come from this is that there is absolutely an effect of being less focused on what you're doing. So like if you are able to be focused on what you're doing, not be distracted, that actually does seem to improve performance. There's actually a number of studies that have come out, and it's not exactly the same. But what they do is they'll have people use social media, like on their phone, just scrolling and looking at it for, let's say, 30 minutes before training. And another group watches an easy documentary, something on like NASA, like the space race. The people who scroll on social media, when they then do a reps to failure test on lifting weights with like 70% of 1RM, they get fewer reps. So having mental fatigue because you're being distracted and your attention is split, that can actually negatively affect your training. Now, that's not very helpful if you've got kids, because it's not like you can lock them in a closet while you train or anything like that. But just be aware that if there was an effect, it's not because of the rest interval. It's probably because it's just harder to be a little more focused. Now, the good news is, okay, if rest interval isn't too important and it's more just about being focused on the training at hand, you can start scheduling it differently. You can go, you know what, I'm going to do a couple of sets in the morning while my kids are eating breakfast, and then I'm going to come back and do the rest of it after I put them down to bed at night or something like that. Or I'm going to do some at lunch or something like that. Like, since you're at home and you're training at home, there's no reason you have to give yourself 1 hour block in a day. You could figure out what are the times when I actually do have some time to myself and I can do one exercise at each one of those points. It's the type of thing that would make no sense if you had to actually drive to the gym each time. But if it's just the other room, now all of a sudden that logistical issue goes away and you can have the flexibility to do that. So that's what I'd recommend for this person in this scenario.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. It's really always an honor and a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.